Sup, Captain Gender here. We're currently in the middle of Transgender Awareness Week, a time where trans people and their allies talk about trans experiences and address problems faced by this community. Throughout history, cis people have had the spotlight. Meanwhile, trans people have, for the most part, gotten either harmful representation or none at all. The same is true about comics. So today we'll be looking at the good, the bad, and the disappointing about trans representation in this media. Note that we will be mainly focusing on the big two, but great stories and characters exist outside of these two companies. Without further delay, let's talk gender and comics. In the golden age of comics, the closest thing to representation trans people had were aliens, shapeshifters, and other characters who had weird relationships to their gender because it had somehow been altered by magic or sci-fi technology. In the 80s, Marvel published a story where Sasquatch, a Canadian superhero who was basically a man that could turn into a beast, was killed. Afterwards, he transferred his soul into a woman, so now the hero had a female body while in human form and a male one while in beast form. Something similar happened to other characters, such as Ultra Humanite and Mantra. Quite honestly, having someone restart their life into the body of a different gender or species just feels like the 80s version of exclusionists mockingly saying people identify as combat choppers, which is a ground extrapolation on what trans realities actually are. Meanwhile, DC wasn't exactly doing better. Camelot 3000 is a story where the Knights of the Round Table are reincarnated into the year 3000 to fight off an alien invasion. Sir Tristan is reborn into a female body and looks for ways to turn into a man. Even when ways to transition already existed at the time the comic was published, the writers somehow thought that Sir Tristan wouldn't find ways to transition more than 2000 years later, so in the story he gave up and stuck with his female body. Some years later, in 1992, the 31st issue of Legion of Superheroes revealed that Siobhan Erin, a female presenting member of the Interplanetary Science Police, was actually a man named Sean. He had been taking a futuristic drug called Profem to look like a woman and seduce Element Lad. It turned out that Element Lad really didn't care about Sean's gender, so the latter stopped taking Profem and reverted to his masculine form. Although Profem resembles the hormone reassignment therapy that a lot of trans people go through, this comic heavily implies that trans women are gay men eager to date straight guys, and will detransition once they have achieved that goal. Stereotypes such as this one are often used to invalidate trans people, or depict them as threatening. Thus, stories such as this one should be avoided. Luckily, in the same decade the Big Two started including actual trans characters, but not always in the most positive way. In the 90s, DC and some of its imprints published works that included real trans characters, and not just shapeshifters. Two of those stories were in Sandman. In A Game of You, we meet Wanda, a trans woman who lives in the same apartment building as Barbie, the main character of this story. Barbie fully supports Wanda, but she's basically the only character to do so. Even deities invalidate Wanda's gender, preventing her from going to Dreamland because the ceremony other characters used was a woman thing. Overall, the story depicts the crude transphobia many still face, fantasy world or not. Also, spoiler alert, this story uses the bury your gays trope, where the tragic life of an LGBTQIA character culminates with an even more tragic death. Another important character from this time is Kate Godwin, aka Coagula, who was introduced to Doom Patrol in 1993. Coagula was a sex worker who gained her powers after sleeping with Revis, another non-cis member from the Doom Patrol. Godwin was created by trans writer Rachel Pollack and written by newly out non-binary writer Grant Morrison, which is refreshing on its own right. However, both Coagula and Revis have their issues. The former is received with mixed feelings from the trans community because of worries concerning the stigmatization this character could convey for the way she gained her powers. The latter would fit into the first category of characters we talked about, being an intersex individual who is formed by the fusion of Larry Trainor, Eleanor Poole, and negative energy. Although these characters are still problematic, they were a step towards the right direction, and they set precedents for better representation that is found nowadays. Before I give examples of really great contemporary trans representation, I wanted to mention the gray zone, that place where authors really try to be inclusive, but fail because of lack of knowledge of the identity they wanted to depict. The prime example of this is Snowflake in The New Warriors, or at least that's what we got from Marvel's preview of them. I'm really not going to go too deeply into this. Both, both their design and their description are rather shallow, and do more to depict the stereotypes of non-binary people than to build a complex, three-dimensional character. If you want to see how authors can escape the gray zone, check out my video on good versus bad representation. And now, let's talk more about accurate trans representation. After Alicia Yao came out as trans in Batgirl number 19, published in 2013, the comic book industry has taken even more steps to include all kinds of trans people. In 2016, Cowboy, one of the main characters in The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, was seen wearing what the series' author confirmed to be a binder, placing him in the transmasculine spectrum. Likewise, 1 year later, DC dedicated most of Supergirl's 19th issue to tell the story of Liz Serrano, a non-binary Latina high school student who Supergirl helps in the process to embrace their identity. And let's not forget we have Sira, who is Angela's partner in Angela, Asgard's assassin. This witty, strong trans woman of color is a really cool example of actual trans representation and not just tokenism. I'm really excited to be seeing more of her and other trans characters. With all of this history, there's just one more thing to talk about. We have already made a huge leap from Ultra Humanite to Sira, but there's still a long road ahead. Overall, there's still a lack of characters who experience transition in the same way a contemporary trans person would, especially when it comes to the gender fluid identity. And for some reason, there are way more trans women than there are trans men, not to talk about people who exist beyond the binary. It is thrilling to hear DC plans to include Kid Quick, a gender fluid speedster, into its future state event set on, well, the future. However, the big two have to work on incorporating more diverse characters to their main universes, and not just alternate Earths and futures that will be forgotten in the vastness of the multiverse. Lastly, DC and Marvel have to make sure that not only their stories are diverse, but also the people who write them. Both companies have to ensure that they include non-cis creators into the teams in charge of these characters to make sure that the experiences depicted are really truthful to trans realities and to avoid falling into the gray zone. That would be everything for this week. Do let me know what you think about trans representation by leaving a comment, and be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video and want to see more like it. See you next time. Gap Gender out!